Welcome to BAM It with John Michael and Mari, covering all things business, accounting, management, marketing, and IT, the place where businesses and entrepreneurs find the forest through the trees.
Hello, guys, and welcome to BAM It. I am John Michael Cletus with Peridot Consulting.
And Mari Peterson with Marketing Outpost.
And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about not blowing it with corporate protections. And before we get into that and our guest of the day, I want to share some interesting facts which are indirectly related to today's topic, but I nonetheless wanted to share them because I did vast research into this. But Americans are $12.58 trillion in debt. And the average household in America has over $16,000 of credit card debt, and that if you ask Americans how much they owe, they did a recent survey of Americans compared to their mortgages, and it was a $420 billion discrepancy, so Americans aren't even really aware of how much they owe. And the reason we're talking about all this debt, because our guest today is Rob Mays with Mays Law Firm. We're going to get with him in a minute. He's a attorney that sort of specializes in well, what do you specialize? I'm going to let him introduce him because I know I'm going to get it wrong when I try to say it.
I specialize in helping businesses that lend money or owed money to collect the money.
Oh, he's a collections attorney.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, maybe he doesn't want to be called a collections attorney. So I have a quick question. This debt that you just talked about, was that all consumer debt?
Yes.
Okay.
Sounds like consumer debt.
Yeah.
Which is really a little different than what I do. And most attorneys who call themselves collection attorneys, they probably specialize in consumer debt. That's credit cards, car loans, mortgages on people's houses. And that's not really what I focus on, although there are lots of interesting topics there. My focus is mostly on business debt. That is, people who borrow money or incur liabilities because of their business operations. Occasionally, I will do something where a private individual has loaned money to another private individual and hasn't been paid back. But most of mine is business debt.
So before we get into the business debt, and we're jumping right in, let's first make sure we know who we have in our studio today. So, Rob, why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. So I went to law school here in North Carolina, and then went and clerked for a federal judge, a court of appeals judge. Then I went to D.C. and worked in a big firm there. There was at the time the largest firm in D.C., had about 500 lawyers in one office. And I did there a lot of litigation of different kinds, but at the time there were many internal corporate investigations, and we would go in and read people's emails and go through their books and find out who knew what about some scandal, sometimes accounting scandals. And I
bet that was interesting stuff.
It was.
Reading people's emails.
Yes, I spent hour upon hour, 100-hour week upon 100-hour week reviewing people's emails. And
the little details pull something big out, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, often. Yeah, sometimes we'd have the whole database of somebody's every email that was ever sent, and you could just spend all the time you wanted.
Was any of this political, like politician focused, or was it?
It was mostly private corporation focused. That the firm had a big investigations practice. That's actually it's the firm that Robert Mueller and some of his team came out of.
Oh wow!
For the Russia investigation, this was in the era of the big accounting scandals. So Enron, WorldCom, and the like, and all these businesses were either going down or had to restate their earnings in some way. And there would be an inevitable government investigation, and often the audit committee would hire our firm to go in and find out what happened and why.
So some fraud investigation. And did you have a lot of accountants on your staff? I'm just curious.
We would engage. We didn't have accountants on our staff. We would engage. Usually one of the big, what was then the big four accounting firms to help consult. Every once in a while, one of our clients were actually accountants, because we would
Don't tell me that.
Yeah, if there had been a company that restated and they hired auditors, and the auditors were under scrutiny from, the people that they answer to, usually the SEC, we would maybe represent them in defending the work that they had done or finding out what they had done, most of which was way above my head in terms of, the accounting side of it. So we relied heavily on accounting experts in those cases. But it was very interesting, and it was an interesting sort of, seeing the guts of how these big nationwide stories really are, one of the things that I learned is that you don't necessarily know from reading the newspaper what these cases are really about. They don't often really translate all that well into news media misses it often.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that kind of background,
so I left. I was not interested in globetrotting for the rest of my career, and that's what being a lawyer at a big firm like that involves, a lot of travel. So I wanted to come back to North Carolina, and got a job with a firm here in town, and it was the depths of the recession, and the only thing that was happening was money collection because lots of companies had gone under. Lots of real estate developments had gone under, which meant loans went under. In some cases, banks went under. And a lot of people owed a lot of other people money. And so I got into bankruptcy and representing creditors in bankruptcy cases, and generally representing creditors in liquidating the collateral that they had, pursuing assets that were not collateral for the loan, but that a borrower would have. And so I've done that now for 8 years, and recently left to do it on my own and focus more on sort of niche part of that practice, which is for higher dollar debt against owed by more sophisticated people who have the means to put assets in LLCs and trusts and try to take some asset protection measures. And I'm on the other side of that, trying to take those businesses apart, take those trusts apart. And I'm also have recently been appointed as a bankruptcy trustee. So when someone files for bankruptcy protection in a liquidation sense, the court will appoint me to make sure that people who have filed qualify, have fully disclosed all their assets. If there is something to liquidate for the benefit of creditors, that's my job.
Well, I'm sorry, Mari.
so I think for many people listening, they might say, oh my gosh, this is that guy that we really want to hate. He's on the other side of the table. However, we have brought him in here today to actually sort of use that insight to help business owners and business people who are on that other side of the table.
Right. And the truth is that I'm not always on the other side of the table, because often the small business that's owed money is my client. Some of my most fulfilling work has been for small businesses and individuals who, went out on a limb for somebody, did a lot of work on credit, and didn't get paid. And so I've helped those people recover money that for them, because of the size of their business, was really critical. And that's pretty fulfilling work. Did
you have something to say, John?
Well, I was just going to say, just to kind of dumb down a little bit what Rob was just saying when he mentioned...
Are you assuming our listeners aren't that smart?
No, I'm doing it for myself. I'm dumbing it down for myself. But when you mention asset protection measures, and what some of that is people create entities. They create LLCs or trusts or corporations, and that will create a legal line between the purpose of it is to create a legal line between their personal life and legal life. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So, there are many benefits of the corporate form, and that we have a few different options there, which I know you've covered in some other podcasts. But the one common thread that runs through those is that these forms provide some liability protection, some legal division between the people who own or operate the business and the assets of the business. So you got your classic, guy's a plumber. He hires employees. The employees are out driving around. There's risk in doing that. Maybe you hit somebody in an intersection. It's, the most basic, one of the most basic benefits of the corporate form is you can incorporate that business, and then that employee who's out there creating risk in the world works for the corporation and not directly for the boss.
Yeah, so the line stops at the corporation's assets. And
if done appropriately, it does. I think, what I see and what, the insight I can offer for people is I see how it goes wrong and how it is not done. Well, in some cases, it's not done at all, which would be a mistake.
Yeah.
And then in many cases, it's done, but it's done in this, amateur self-help way, so that when a guy like me comes along, you really have no protection.
Yeah, so people are doing these entities. You kind of do them for two reasons. One is accounting, and there's accounting benefits, which we've talked to. And then the other ones are the legal benefits. And if you're doing it for the legal benefits and you do it wrong, then you're not accomplishing the goal of doing it in the first place. Is that maybe
that's right?
Correct statement?
That's exactly right. I think there's other benefits too. The classic benefit of corporation was to raise money. You get a lot of aggregate people's resources together towards some big venture, and so people incorporate because it creates a way for them to raise capital. But an asset protection is definitely a big consideration. It's something that people, when people start to acquire some resources because their business or profession is successful, they start thinking of ways of, hanging on to those. And as new assets come in, reasonably sophisticated people, they think, oh, I've read, I should have a limited liability company that holds this asset instead of me personally. Sometimes it's protecting that asset. Sometimes it's anonymity. You just don't want your own name on this business or this property. Sometimes it's estate planning purposes. So an estate planning lawyer has advised you that if this asset is held in a certain way, that you might be able to transfer it to people while you're living and get a benefit from that. Now, I am not, and this, is a disclaimer I should make, I'm not either an estate planning attorney or a corporate attorney. So I would never take on to myself the responsibility of advising somebody about what kind of form to use, what sort of, whether to use an LLC versus an S Corp or a C Corp. That's really for accountants and tax lawyers and corporate lawyers. And I am not one of those.
So you come in after all that's been done.
Yes.
And then there comes a monetary dispute or issue.
Yes.
And then you evaluate that. So let's talk about that. You talked about the topic being not blowing it with corporate protections. Can you talk about those common mistakes that people make?
Sure. And I think the first mistake would be not to use these at all, and just, you've got a business and it's growing and you just keep it in your name and operate as a sole proprietorship. And, depending on what kind of business you have, that could create a lot of risks for you personally. Especially, the example that I gave earlier is the one I think about most often, which is, someone's got a plumbing business. They start hiring employees. They buy more trucks, and all of a sudden, it's not just the boss out there going house to house, but all these other people who are out driving around doing work that may or may not be good, and all of that creates a potential for liability. And one way you deal with that is getting a lot of insurance, which is always wise. And the other way you deal with it is you incorporate, and you make it so that those people are not employees of you personally. They are employees of the corporation. That the trucks are not yours, but they are an asset of the corporation. And then if there is some event that happens and, you get sued, or somebody, at least, you get a nasty letter from a lawyer wanting you to pay money, it's really just the corporation that they can look to, and not, let's say, the house that you inherited from mom. So you get some. The first mistake is not to try to use some kind of corporate form to do business in. But the second is to sort of go off and do it in some amateur way. Maybe you go on some website that purports to be able to create the right entity for you, and you spend a night reading about what an LLC is, and do it as cheaply as possible, and then have somebody go to the register of deeds and record a deed, and you think you're done, and that sort of self-help corporate formation.
They end up with
I think that's what I did.
Well, you may end up with you think you're being smart, and you end up with like a Nevada corporation, which
Yes.
in reality.
I wondered about that lawyer from out there.
Yes.
So I would say this sounds very relevant to a lot of family-owned businesses. I would see that being quite important for them.
Or anybody who owns real estate, people who
So basically,
lease
if you have
property.
anything you want to protect that has financial value, and you want to protect that from some sort of issue relating to your business, then you need to set that up correctly.
That's right. And it may be that you go to a corporate lawyer and your accountant and look at what the costs of administering that corporations are going to be and what the real benefits are, and you say, it's not really worth. I think I can just keep operating the way I am. But it's at least worth answering the question or asking the question. And, then when you do it, if you don't do it in some way that has legitimacy, at least the appearance of legitimacy, it's not going to do you any good.
So talk about that. When you say, I guess what you're saying, when people don't do it correctly, there's something that they're missing. So if I have a do-it-yourself lawyer, that I've gone online, I filled out some form, I filed it, and I think, oh, I'm done, but I'm not. So go into that.
That's right. So the most common thing that I see now is someone who owns real estate, and they think that they will get some protection from having every piece of real estate they own in a different LLC. And there's just one owner. There's only one. An LLC has members, whereas a corporation would have stockholders. They will go out, form these LLCs, pay the Secretary of State $200. They are single member LLCs, so for tax purposes, they're pass-through entities. You guys have talked about that on another podcast. And basically, for legal liability purposes, they are also, just as they are for tax purposes, for legal liability purposes, they're disregarded entities. Now, which means you have the entity there, but it's not really providing any real separation. If you happen to cause some accident or default on some loan or do someone wrong in some way, and they get a judgment against you, that single member LLC is not going to be, and that person hires me, and I find your single member LLCs, I'm going to be able to get at those assets.
Wow. So that's in many ways news to me. Then why do people, if you can get at it so easily,
or conversely, what should they do on top of that?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
So it's not necessarily easy, so if it's a small amount of money and to an unsophisticated creditor, that LLC may provide protection. I mean, first off, because it may be that they don't ever find the asset. Because it's in the name of this LLC, they look at the tax rolls, they don't know that you own this thing. And so I don't want to say that there is no protection. There's the protection of it not being in your name, and there might be some extra steps that the creditor's going to have to take. But
it just sounds very thin.
In general, it's very thin. And it's not just, there are other considerations. Is all the ownership in one person? Is all the day-to-day control in one person? Is this just a single asset, that actually relies on outside contributions to keep it funded every year? Is it one of the things that the courts will look at is this really, this person has sort of one single business enterprise, and they've just divided it up into a million tiny pieces to try to find it, to try to make it difficult. Basically, does it pass the smell test? Is this actually some separate entity that has some purpose other than just a shell for protecting somebody's assets? And if it's just a shell, ultimately, if you owe somebody enough money, it's not going to help you. But the difference between a shell and something that actually will protect you may not be that far. Something like having additional members. and maybe so instead of just the wife who inherited some property or bought a piece of property being the sole member, maybe the husband and wife together will be the members.
And that creates additional...
You get some additional benefit from that because it gives it some legitimacy. I mean, corporations, the original idea was, for people to get together in a common enterprise. Maybe it was buying a ship to send to India to pick up spices, now it's, owning some, rental properties or something. If just one person, we have this concept in the law of an alter ego, which is there's a difference between, well, put it this way, if I'm in a business, let's say I'm in the business of owning rental properties, and I form a single member LLC, and I just deed all of the properties into the single member LLC. And otherwise I operate in all the same ways. There's no board meetings. There are no votes on anything. I do what I want, when I want, and the properties are just owned by the LLCs. Those are not going to provide much protection. And I think the people have this idea that I went on this website and they told me to incorporate it, and I put the property in this LLC. I'm done. And that's just not a sound business practice. There was a case in the Court of Appeals, North Carolina Court of Appeals, just a couple of years ago about basically this scenario, that it was a family-owned company that operated rental properties, and they got into a dispute with their management company about fees. And there were several LLCs that owned different rental properties. And there were multiple members, all family members in these entities. And the sort of father of the family did not have a majority interest. So he didn't make the first mistake of being the sole member. But there was enough evidence that basically he made all decisions, had what they call complete domination and control over this entity, that the courts were willing to let at least that claim go to a jury that, this is not just the LLCs that are liable for these fees, but this individual. Because really, when you get down to it, it's just him. Like day in and day out, it's really just him.
Well, a lot of businesses might be that person, even if they want to be protected. So we're talking a lot about an LLC. So if we talk about another entity like a corporation, is it sort of the same situation that if you're just that one person?
So it's hard to generalize because, all these things are context specific.
Correct.
Which people hate it when lawyers and accountants say that, but it's true. But in general, I would say, the LLC that form is more protective than the corporation.
It's more protective than a corporation.
It is for this reason. If you owe me money and you own stock in a corporation, I can have that stock sold to satisfy the debt. I mean, this would be, I have to sue you and I get a judgment. The court says, yes, this person owes this person money. And if I have that judgment and against you and you have stock in a corporation, literally I can have the sheriff take custody of the stock and sell it.
So if I own my own corporation, I own 100% of the stock, you can in essence
sell your company.
Force me to sell my company.
That's right.
To satisfy a debt.
That's right. Or if you were to file for bankruptcy, the bankruptcy trustee who steps into your shoes could also sell the company, find a willing buyer and sell it.
That's scary.
If you're an LLC, and, I criticize this approach, but the approach that the legislature has taken is to say you can't sell someone's membership interest in an LLC. All you can do is charge their membership interest with payment of the debt. And so you get what's called a charging order that says, dear LLC, you have a member that owes this debt. Any money that you would distribute to that member, you should instead pay to this creditor until this debt is paid. And that is a lot less effective remedy than I'm just going to sell your interest, because there's a lot that can be done on the back end of a business to reduce or totally negate distributions. And if you're just a creditor and then you just know that, XYZ LLC is supposed to give you money instead of giving it to the creditor at the end, or the debtor at the end of the year. That's pretty hard to police. But a single member LLC that is really subject to what we call an alter ego claim, which is just, yes, this is an LLC, but it's just one guy who does business through it. And then what I would do as the creditor is, from the outset, I would sue the LLC.
So sometimes you see an LLC that chooses to be taxed as an S corp or C corp.
Yeah.
So, and I'll be frank, sometimes that confuses me sometimes, because then if they're an LLC taxed as a corporation, they have what we call phantom stock, because it's not a legal corporation. It's a legal LLC. So when you get into these cases and see that, do you treat them as an LLC or as a corporation?
They're treated as an LLC for that purpose. So
it's sometimes for a small business, maybe you should do the LLC because it's harder to break, and then choose to be an S corp or a C corp.
I think, again, it's hard to generalize, but I would say that is what you elect, how you elect to be taxed is not going to affect what creditors' remedies are against you.
So it's your legal formation. So if you legally with the Secretary of State become an LLC, that's how you're treated. Your phantom stock or tax returns, whatever, and how you pay yourself and all that's irrelevant.
Totally separate. Now, some of the operational details are highly relevant, and so it's not just, sort of to start off with, consult with a professional about what form to use and do it right. If you're going to do an LLC, do an operating agreement.
Even if it's with yourself?
Well, right. I mean, but, presumably, or one of the sort of indicia that you are legitimately in business is that you might bring on another member, and some of the benefits of having an LLC are how easy it is to bring on other members. You don't have to issue stock. You just, assign to somebody, a portion of your membership interest. Depending on I would say the overall point would be, if you want to have the benefits of these corporate forms, give it some legitimacy. If it's you and your children who are the members of this LLC, have meetings. Document them as meetings. Have votes. Document them as votes. Observe all of the separations that an accountant would advise you to observe. Have separate accounts. Don't commingle money. If you move assets from the LLC to yourself or vice versa, document the reason. Consult with an accountant about how to book those transactions so that they have some legitimacy. If I go and look at someone who owes one of my clients money, well, first of all, if they have 15 LLCs, that's a red flag. Like most people who are in, operating in business in good faith, don't need that many entities. If you got too many, it suggests you're hiding something. But if I go in and I see that somebody has several entities and money and assets are moving in and out of those seemingly willy-nilly, when they are paying personal bills out of the corporate accounts that have no justifiable business purpose. One that I saw was odd is paying your kid or grandkids dance tuition out of your corporate account, for the dance academy. That's probably not, a legitimate.
What about if they accounted for it as a loan to shareholder or loan?
Well, if you ask about it, it's an advertisement. It was marketing.
Maybe it was.
Well, and maybe
that's just a creative account.
Maybe it was. It's all about degrees.
I know.
But you certainly see who, and I think it's unfortunate, but this is much more common than it should be for the rest of us who pay our share of taxes, that people form an LLC, have their paychecks deposited into it, pay their personal expenses out of it, and think that because it was paid for out of the business,
it's a business
account,
expense.
that it's a business expense.
I've never seen that before.
I'm sure none of your clients have ever done that, but I have seen that on many occasions, and
Wow.
or borrow money immediately in my personal name, immediately transfer it into the corporation and have no documentation of why that was done. Didn't
Yeah.
book any. Book it as a loan or a receivable. Just moved money around.
We come in both of our professions. We probably come across people that, I don't mean this to be degrading, but think they're being smart, but they're being stupid.
Yes.
And this is an example of that. They think they're being smart. Oh, look, I got an LLC, I got a business, and I can write my personal expenses off.
Right.
No, in reality, you're being stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to use those terms,
Yes.
and pardon my degradation.
Yeah. Although I think, part of the reason that that myth survives and maybe is growing stronger is that people's actual audit risk is probably not as high as it was at one point. There just are not that many IRS agents out there doing active, detailed audits on small businesses and individuals.
Yeah. Just because you haven't been caught doesn't mean you're doing it right.
That's right. Or that there won't be some consequence. And it might be that, and another, thing. So do these things, make these decisions, document them. Also keep your documents. I mean, I've had cases where there's, these entities that purport to be doing all this business and there's no documentation of anything. They can't find their operating agreement. They can't find their stock. They can't find their, board meeting minutes.
What would be sufficient for like a board? If I have an LLC with my kids,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, would it just a handwritten
Jeez,
note?
John
or
Michael, are you
email?
worried about your alter ego?
No. I'm worried about just having clients and having a career. Yeah.
Well, so first of all, having anything with your kids is probably
Well, that was a bad
if
example.
minor children is probably always questionable.
My
and
dogs, my cats, maybe.
it might be legitimate. That's something I would talk to a corporate attorney about. Certainly, if I came across somebody after the fact, and they started an LLC, transferred an asset in there, and then gave their children majority interest in the LLC and themselves, minority interest, but then did everything and made all the decisions, I would,
What about if the
attack
profits
that.
went into like a kid's savings account or something, and it really was set up? Say they set this
Mhm.
rental property up as like a kid's college fund,
Mm-hmm.
and they made the kid the majority owner because they'll give it to them when they graduate college, and the funds go into their savings.
Well, that would
account.
certainly give it a more of an air of legitimacy. If the profits really are separated, really are managed in a prudent way, and are not just sort of another purse for the manager,
Yeah.
to dip into.
And if they're putting it in the kid's name, they're trying to, because you don't have to report up to a certain amount if your kid earns
Mhm.
that income, and they're thinking they're accomplishing that, but they're not putting the money into their actual kid's account, and they're using it for their family vacation or something.
Yeah, I mean, what I see often is, some business deal goes bad, the economy does a downturn, and people, it might even be a foundation that they set up, and then they start dipping into it, and at will, and then
Oh.
that really, whatever argument they had before that this was a legitimate thing goes away when they're dipping into it for their missed mortgage payment.
Yeah.
So, investigate corporate forms, consult a professional, use one that makes the most sense, document it properly, observe some corporate formalities. Don't move money at random without booking it properly. Don't move assets at random without booking that properly. And then if for some reason you need to close an entity down, defunct, or because it owes money that it can't pay. This I see often with,
Or you sell it.
or well, if you sold the assets that were in it. Yeah. I see this often with people who are in construction and construction trades. Where one entity for whatever reason is not panning out and want to kind of get a fresh start. Don't just go in on day one and move all the property and accounts into the new company name. Consult with some professionals about how to start that new entity so that it really will have a fresh start. And it's not just viewed legally as just a continuation of the new one, of the old business. I had a case once. It was a construction related company. They had debts they couldn't pay. They just sort of shut it down. Principals filed for bankruptcy personally, but they started a new company. The new company picked up all the business that the old company was working on. The new company got all the vehicles that had been owned by the old company. The employees were the same. There was no functional distinction between the old company and the new company.
It was just a change of name, basically.
Just a change of name.
Hmm.
And, and that person that new company had to pay some money.
So my takeaway from this, not being a legal or accounting professional, just a good old business person who did set up an LLC, is that if you truly have assets you want to protect from your business activities, then you should consult a professional, as you said, because it sounds to me like a lot of things are done on the surface and there really are some additional things that person should do. And number two, that once they consult the professional, they need to follow through on the recommendations, right? And then not allow, I guess, this intermixing and mingling on the accounting side, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I would say that nails it. And, don't stop at the formation stage. Continue treating these things like legitimate entities that have a separate purpose and a separate identity from you. And review periodically how you're doing it. And, review it. Maybe you get to a certain point where you're making a certain amount of money where for tax purposes it no longer makes sense to be an LLC and you want to be an S corp or a C corp, and so go see your accountant about that. It's not just these choices are not sort of one-time static things that you can just ride for the rest of your life. You need to take a look at it every once in a while.
So it sounds to me, and I want to make sure I'm clear about this, in your work you were there after there's been some sort of financial dispute. Do people come to you to say, hey, I really want you, because it sounds like you're very good at looking for the cracks and the holes in these corporate protections.
That's my job.
And so do people come to you and say, hey, listen, I want you to evaluate my stuff from that perspective and tell me where I'm weak?
Actually, so I've gotten a couple of requests to do that, and I can for certain people, but I have to know first who they owe money to, because I couldn't advise someone about. I couldn't advise. If they happen to owe money to a client of mine, I wouldn't want to have. I could sort of consult and would on the side look at what somebody else has done and offer my perspective. But there's a lot of other. But I would say, for a really substantial estate, I would definitely not be a one-stop shop. You need to be talking to an estate attorney. You need to be talking to an accountant, maybe a financial advisor, and a corporate attorney.
If you're big enough, you probably have a pretty good team. I mean, if you're the Biltmore estate,
you'd be surprised.
They probably have a team of people that go through all of that.
Yes, but you would be shocked at how people can have these really substantial estates. Maybe they inherited quite a bit of real estate or the family business, and dad always ran the family business in the old school handshake way and built this thing up and never wanted to pay professionals to do anything, and then it's compounded over time and it's grown into this really big thing, and nobody has ever gone back to really look at all these corporate decisions and tax decisions. I mean, I see that all the time. And people don't even know the answer to who does own this property, who owns these vehicles, who, they think they know because somebody said something at Sunday dinner, but they really don't.
Yeah.
So for everyone out there, if you do have all of these assets or a family business and you haven't evaluated that by a professional, it's probably a good idea to do so.
Yeah. I mean, if you're managing a big business and you don't have a corporate attorney and a tax attorney and an accountant who are looking at these things, you are being penny wise and pound foolish. Yes.
That's a good way to wrap that up.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions?
No, everything when I approach anything when it comes to these entities, it's always from an accounting perspective. And it's just funny how apples and oranges this is. And when they came up with these entities, obviously they're legal formations, but there's tax considerations. And I have to say all the time, I'm not an attorney, and sometimes an attorney will get you set up in something that isn't great for tax or vice versa. and trying to cross that. And most of the time you can do something that's legally beneficial and tax beneficial.
But there's probably going to be some disclaimers to be made about, these are the benefits in this case, but there are some drawbacks,
Correct.
Some risks just in case.
Yeah.
There's no perfect thing. And there's, it's just like there's no, I would imagine in your business, you tell people a lot of times, there's no way to make a bunch of money and not pay any taxes.
Correct. At the end of the day, if you're making money, you're paying tax.
Right. And, there's no way to own something and have full control over it, and not at the end of the day, it be considered yours.
Yeah.
And so, you have to make, and sometimes in these, business decisions, you gotta make tough calls between, do you want all the asset protection or do you want all the control? Or do you need to bring in some other owners? Do you need to cede some control? And particularly in family-owned businesses, those are tough decisions. But it's certainly a question you need to ask.
And it's a self look in the mirror, like how exposed do I truly think I am to have to do that? I mean, some people are like, I'm running a bakery. I don't feel like I have. Of course, you never know. That's probably a bad example.
Someone may choke at the bakery
correct.
This afternoon.
You're running a podcast. Maybe that's even worse. I'll probably say something wrong. Well, okay, we want to thank you guys for joining us today, and please be sure to review this episode. And for more information on who we are or this podcast, please visit www.bammit.com. That's BAMM-IT.com. And our next podcast is going to be about embracing new technologies in business. So we're going to get into some IT. And we want to thank Rob. Rob, did you want to share a email and website?
You can check out my website. It's www.mayslawfirmnc.com. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast should not be considered professional advice and is for entertainment purposes only. The hosts and guests of this podcast may make terrible attempts at being funny, and this podcast does not defend the merits of this humor, nor does it guarantee that the humor will be successful. It is not guaranteed that you will find this as entertaining as the hosts find themselves.